Hello, everyone. Welcome to Creativity Hive's weekly program. My name is Miriam Haugen. I'm part of the Creativity Hive team. We help creatives learn to make impactful storytelling videos through one-on-one teaching and live group coaching. Very excited to bring you this week's guest, Paul Murphy. But first, a word from our sponsor for this week. Get your Santa hats on.
Santa Experience Oregon creates a magical experience for your children and heirloom art for you that we will treasure for a lifetime. Watch while your children have milk and cookies with Santa, find their names in the nice book, and so much more. Visit santaexperienceoregon.com.
All right. So, welcome to the stage, Paul Murphy. Paul
Hello.
is a motion designer, editor, and known for the Premiere Pro YouTube channel. Go to his YouTube channel. So, tell us, Paul, about how you got to where you're at now. Did you go to film school? What training did you get?
That's a good question because I grew up loving films. My formative years for watching films as a child was the 80s. So, that was the era of Spielberg and Lucas, and that was a great film school for me growing up. When I finished high school, here in Australia, there are not a lot of film schools, which is a bit different in America, of course. And I just looked at the amount of people that film schools took in Australia, and I was like, well, I'm never going to get into that. I don't have anything to show. So I opted instead I studied writing in college. I wanted to become a writer. Specifically, I wanted to become a children's writer. And while studying writing, a friend of mine handed me a book that was called The Writer's Journey, which is basically it's an easier to read version of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, which if anybody has sort of looked into, film structure, it all comes from Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, which is a book that looks at all of the different stories throughout different cultures and how they all have the same structure and same elements. So I read this, which used a lot of films that I knew growing up as references. So like Star Wars is a classic example of The Hero's Journey. And that got me thinking, well, maybe I want to be a screenwriter. So I got into writing screenplays. But then, realized that once a screenplay is finished, it's not really a work of art yet. For it to become a work of art, it needs to be filmed. and the key there is it needs to be edited. And I didn't know any filmmakers or editors, so I did all that myself. And it was during the editing process that I realized, oh, this is writing. This is writing with pictures. This is using all those same elements that I'm familiar with, which is rhythm and structure and things like that. So basically got into filmmaking with the mindset of a writer, and got into editing with the mindset of a writer, and am completely self-taught, but also have always had like a strong technical fascination as well. I think I love software. I find software so interesting, the way that it automates a lot of processes, and editing is nothing but processes. So, and I was also raised by a father who was one of the first generation of computer teachers here in Australia. So he was teaching some of the early Apple computers in high school. So always had that sort of background as well. And then one day I opened up Premiere Pro, and just everything sort of made sense to me. It's like, oh, this is a system. This is a database. And, this is helping me do the processes I need to do editing. So sort of got really fascinated by the technical side of editing as much as the creative writing side of editing as well. And that ultimately led to my career as a film editor. amongst other things. And yeah, I continue to be fascinated by the software as much as the creative aspect of it as well.
That is awesome. That is what happened, of course, with Neil. And I think that Mo is
Hi,
probably
Paul.
more
Amen.
into the creative side of things. And Neil, though, he got totally sucked into the software and just loved it. He is not with us. He's behind the scenes. He's watching and probably going to be giving us some questions and comments and a hard time. But so when was it? I'm curious about when was it that you started using Premiere Pro?
I started using Premiere Pro with Premiere Pro 6 was the first version I ever used. So that puts us early 2000s. And I'm not saying Premiere Pro CS6. In fact, I'm not even saying Premiere Pro. This was just called Premiere 6, which was still A/B editing. So like you basically just had 2 video tracks. And if you wanted to do a cross dissolve, you had one on the top track and one on the bottom track, and you would do a cross dissolve between them like that. But around the corner was Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro started with what at the time we were calling Premiere 7. And that's when I think Premiere and Adobe were making more of a concerted effort to appeal to sort of long form editors. And definitely from my perspective, the software just suddenly really expanded out and was trying to be more of a serious editing program. And I guess it expanded at a time that my mind was expanding as well. And the other thing, and something that I often say to up and coming editors, people who are sort of studying editing, is one of the great things about learning editing, sort of being self-taught back then, is that there was no YouTube at the time. And the only way that you could learn a program is to go out and buy.
World without YouTube, that is hard to even remember.
Go back to those old days, but I think nowadays you think, well, I'm trying to do this. I'll search for a video on how to do this. And that's great. You get an immediate answer and you move on. The way you had to learn back then is you would buy a book, and it would be a big, thick book on the application. And I was lucky that my work at the time was a long commute. So I would just take all of these books with me and I would just read them cover to cover. And as a result, I had this really comprehensive knowledge of exactly what the software could do. And I would read a chapter on something, even though it didn't necessarily relate to what I was trying to do at the time, I knew that it could do that. And what I began to realize is when I started working as an editor, a problem would come up and everybody would be like, how can we do this? And it's like, well, there's this little feature in here that will allow you to do that. And people are like, how do you know that? It's like, well, I read the chapter on that book. So it gave me a really strong base level understanding of the software. And from that point on, it meant that I was always just like adding features to my knowledge of the book, my knowledge of the software, sorry. So that was a really good way to learn back then. But I completely agree that I don't want to go back to that time, but it was a good way to learn at the time.
Yes.
And Paul, so how do you feel the new kind of generation now, the YouTube generation, how has the learning curve affected the new generation compared to how we learned it? Do you feel it's now counterproductive, or is it helpful, or what are your thoughts really?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't say it's counterproductive, because I think that up and coming editors now have the advantage that we all have video cameras in our hands, and we can just shoot stuff and immediately go out and start playing around with it. When I started out, I had to pay a significant amount of money to rent a camera or buy a camera, and that's how we would learn. But you can learn, on your weekend, when you get home at night, just shoot something and start cutting with it. I think that's absolutely amazing. So the sort of hands-on experience you can get is fantastic. But I do find that, there is, and this is true of editors of my generation as much of the up and coming generation, is that there can be a lack of curiosity, and that I didn't start teaching editing until I would say, how long would it be? Probably about 10 years ago, I started teaching as well. And that's when I learned that even veteran editors were sort of only knowing about 20%. And that's no exaggeration. Only knew about 20% of what their software that they used every single day could do.
Yeah.
And that's where it's like, I totally think that the best way to approach a bit of software is curiosity. What else can this do? What are the little things in this menu that this program can do that I've never thought about because it's never come up in my day-to-day job? And I think that editors, by and large, do have that lack of curiosity. And they also, I think that most editors feel as though a brute force solution to a problem is always better than an elegant solution. I think that's just, a more comfortable place to be. Is I would rather add this clip 1,000 times to a timeline rather than come up with an automated solution that's built into the software that will allow me to do it in 1 minute. And when I think of the equation of those two approaches, for me, if I could just get the rote, repetitive process done quicker, that's more time for me to be creative and think about something. Because for me, it's all ultimately about creativity and having the time to try something out. Whereas if you're spending your time doing a process 1,000 times, you're dedicating more time to doing something that requires no thinking at all. I would much rather be using that time to be solving something creatively than technically.
Yeah, sure. What I find with the new, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that the guys that and 90% of 99% of people go out there on YouTube. I don't know how to do, like you said, a cross dissolve. So, how do you do it? And it's all over YouTube. Thousands of little.
Yeah, that's me. I'm going, I know you can do this. I can't remember how to do this. And I don't want to bother Mo or Neil, which will help me. If I get really stuck, then I know who to go to. But I'll go to YouTube.
So what happens, I find, what I've been seeing is that they learn it from YouTube and then they recreate it, right? And that's pretty much being spoon fed really quickly. And what happens is that you might have noticed this sort of trend when a lot of the content kind of looks the same these days. You've got the glitch effects and, it's just kind of the same stuff over and over again. The footage is different, but the kind of stuff you see on Instagram, guys running through the fields with cameras and trying all sorts of weird and wonderful things, it's pretty repetitive stuff. And I'm not seeing anything really groundbreaking. I haven't seen anything really great. Hands on a field of corn it's been done to death. Getting that golden light done to the death. So to me, unfortunately, what I find is that YouTube has been counterproductive in the following manner. They look at it, they recreate it, but they don't get to think out the box. They just recreate. Whereas before, as you pointed out, we were forced to look at what the software actually could do. So how do you do a cross dissolve? There's no YouTube to check this up. There's no book that really explains the whole thing to you. And if the book does explain it to you, by the time you reach page 4, you just, you go between a book and your software and you commuting at the same time. So it's become a little bit weird. And if you watch the side-by-side documentary, which I'm sure you have, Martin Scorsese very aptly put it that there's a ton of it's a plethora of footage out there, but 90% of it is not good. That's what he said. Not exactly those words, but in something similar to that. So I find that the younger generation that are coming up are just following trends now. They're kind of just following trends, but you find maybe one or two who will break out of that box, unfortunately. Because the proper kind of training like you do and I do is not, they don't follow that. They don't like the one-on-one training. I don't know what it is, but the nuances of becoming an editor can never be taught. Narrative editing, you cannot teach narrative editing. It's very difficult to teach someone how to create that emotion on screen.
Yeah.
There is a plus side to YouTube, of course, which allows the first timers to come in and share. People are sharing knowledge with them, and then it actually lights that little spark that makes them want to learn the software. So there's I think a little bit of pros and cons. For me, the cons are outweighing the pros at the moment. But what do you think?
I think that it's also a result of there just being a massive content out right now. Is that, I mean, really, like, great art, a Scorsese should only be in the top 2% as well. It's just that so many people can make something right now that I think that normal curve would be consistent if everybody had access to the tools back then as well. It's a bit like, when we all had Word, we didn't all become Stephen King. Everybody could write, a book, but not everybody could write them as well as Stephen King could. But yeah, I mean, I remember sort of when I started learning After Effects, which was the next thing I started learning after Premiere Pro. My go-to at the time was Andrew Kramer from Video Copilot, which was just some of the most amazing tutorials I had ever seen. And I definitely, like, the first 10 or so tutorials of his, I found that I was just making stuff that looked like his stuff.
Right.
But at some point, something happened, and I can see it if I look at, like, the first ever show reel of my material that I put out. The first show reel, all of my stuff just looked like Andrew Kramer's stuff. But at some point, I was sort of learning the craft more than the techniques. And that's when I started to realize, I guess, like, what you're trying to do is you're trying to strengthen the muscle between what's up here and being able to put that onto a screen. And that doesn't come the first time. I kind of equate it to GPS. Is like, when I have a GPS in my car and it's telling me where to go, if you told me how to get there again just from memory, I would forget, because I'm just listening to the GPS say, now turn here, now turn here. It's when I switch the GPS off and I actually think about where I'm trying to go that I'm actually better at getting there. So I think it's the same thing. And just from the normal curve of great creativity versus, sort of low level creativity, most people would be just sort of like, yeah, show me how to do a cross dissolve. But that doesn't mean you can do a cross dissolve like Francis Ford Coppola or Walter Murch in Apocalypse Now. That takes real experimentation and thought and playing with the tools to get to that point.
Yeah. Look, also, you notice on social media, the guys are sitting. You shoot with an iPhone, and you have an iPhone or whatever it is. And I noticed even low level stuff is being now shot with Komodos and Dragons. Everyone's got access to. They're buying these little cameras to play around with. I mean, these big cameras to play around with, and it looks the same like it's shot on an iPhone, because they don't have a DP or anything like that sitting behind them. There's no proper lighting, which is 90% of the shot is the lighting and what to do with it. So it's a new kind of weird little trend that I've just seen, where you see these little snippets of guys shooting some stuff, but it's a red. Or I haven't seen them playing with an Alexa yet. I think that's a little bit large, the form factor for them to play with. But it's almost a paradigm shift over the last, I would say, 6 months to 8 months, where people are moving away from phones and are beginning to experiment with large form factor cameras. So it's interesting to see what's going to come out of that. If there's any short films that are going to, but the weird thing is the short films that you see out there in the festivals are still not being shot to perfection. And student films, as you might know, are still looking like student films. No matter what lens is being used, you can see a student film a mile away. So it's weird. It's all kind of converging. And at some point, something's going to happen that's going to change the industry, I think, really put it upside down on its head. And I'm actually very interested to see when that point is going to be reached. It'll be pretty interesting to see what happens.
And I think that is also a product of the fact that film has traditionally been a collaborative format. It has required so many different experts in their field to come together and make something. But with the democratization of the tools, we're moving more towards the jack of all trades, somebody who can do everything. Like I've heard of director's courses where day one of a director's course is how to write a script. And it's like, well, that's not directing. That's screenwriting. That's a completely different skill. And definitely when you're, I think that like business wise, the business side of this is pushing people to be more a jack of all trades. And I definitely see the value in jack of all trades, because I've certainly flourished in that environment as well, where I've been like, I'll edit it and I'll do motion graphics as well, because I love those two things. But the important thing is if you're going to put yourself in charge of a different department, you've got to approach that like somebody who's an expert in that department. You can't, a lot of the times when I'm teaching editors how to do motion graphics, their response is, well, isn't there a quicker way to do that? And it's like, yeah, the quicker way is to use presets or something like that. But if you really want to become a master of this area, you've got to approach it like a master, and you've got to appreciate that this is a separate craft to the other craft. As editing is, it's a very fast process. Motion graphics is a very slow process. You've got to slow down the brain in a way and sort of think, what exactly am I trying to do here? And this shouldn't be moving as fast as editing something. This should be moving much slower. You should be focusing. 10 seconds should take a day. It shouldn't take the same amount of time it would take you to edit 10 seconds of video.
Definitely. 100%.
That is a fascinating way to think about it. Yeah, it's totally different. I do want to say hi to Russ and to Leo. Thank you for joining us. And Neil. Neil wants to know, I think, about your mic. He's very impressed with your mic.
Oh, if I was any kind of professional, I would have turned it around so that the brand is facing. But this is a Rode. This is a Rode mic. Yeah, this is just a Rode. I'm by the way, I'm terrible with hardware. I love software. I think about software every day. When it comes to hardware, I just say to people who know, what should I get? And everybody said, get a Rode. So that's what I got.
What do you currently edit on? I mean, what's your hardware like?
Same thing. Like I get recommendations and I don't want to think about them beyond that. So I'm using an iMac. This is a 2020 iMac with 64 gig of RAM. This is before the M1. And you know, I've cut 3 feature films on this, and it's certainly been up to the task. But hardware wise, I'm like, look, I just want to make a decision that's based on budget, and I never want to think about it again. But in terms of software, I'll be very finicky about what I choose and how I use it and things like that. But hardware, I don't have the budget to test hardware. So usually I'm just looking for who knows and what do they recommend, basically.
And interesting point that you said you're pretty sticky about software. What drove you to the Adobe side of things?
Oh, well, I think that was just the gods, because everybody's first editing software, they'll all argue that it's the best and it's the only one you should be using. I just happened, one of my first ever like actual jobs as an editor was this really sort of dates me, but back in 2007, I think it was, this craze sort of took off, which was books should have book trailers, which are like films, like film trailers, but for books. And I had worked in publishing, so I knew a lot of people in publishing. And I was saying, well, I'm a video person. I could make you a book trailer for you. And one of the first bits of software that was presented to me was Premiere. And I had experience with databases and coding and things like that. I also had a lot of experience with Photoshop and InDesign up until that point. So I felt very comfortable in the interface because it reminded me of other Adobe apps. And certainly I've tried other editing platforms. I've edited a feature film in Avid before. Didn't really care for it. And I know that is because I've already climbed that learning curve with Premiere, that it would be sort of starting from scratch to move to other applications. But at the moment, I'm actually doing quite a bit of editing using Descript, which is an exciting bit of software that I kind of think is the future of editing personally. And I am having to climb that learning curve. I'm kind of like, where do I click on the file? Is it the name? Is it the icon? Like, I'm going through all of that stuff that I had to learn from Premiere 20 years ago. I'm having to go through that for the first time, and I'm trying to be as humble as possible because, you know, one of the big things I did when I moved to New York was I taught a lot of veteran editors how to edit in Premiere. And these are people who had been using Final Cut 7 and Avid beforehand. And a lot of them is like, why can't I just do it like this? And it's like, well, because this is a different bit of software and it does things differently, and it's not right or wrong. It's just different. So I'm sort of getting a taste of my own medicine, learning Descript for the first time and sort of going, why can't I just get to it like, well, this is a different bit of software and you got to do things a little bit differently.
And why do you think, you said you think it might be the future? Is there any particular reason?
I think that my personal prediction is that, you know, we've been this 20 years of the digital revolution, we've gotten used to editing with frames and editing with waveforms. And I think that where we're headed is editing with words and editing with AI describing what's in a frame. And I think a lot of the stuff that I'm editing at the moment is very dialogue based. One of them's a podcast. And to be able to select a phrase on a screen and say, no, move that phrase over here, rather than going, is this waveform where the word starts? Is this waveform where the sentence ends? Let's move that over here. I think that more and more we're going to head towards this world of like, no, you're moving words around. You're not moving waveforms around.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so Neil had just wanted to paraphrase, moving back to what you were talking about, the difference between editing and motion graphics is just that the editing process should be fast based on your ability and craft level, but motion graphics requires you to slow down your brain and take time to consider and try alternatives.
Exactly. Well said, Neil.
So
you think you're going to be moving over to Descript permanently at any point?
Well, I can kind of see Premiere is heading in that direction with its transcripts, and certainly the beta of Premiere at the moment, they're looking for more of what I was just describing, which is selecting a phrase and being able to cut that around, and that phrase moves with the clip. I still don't think Premiere is quite there. I strongly feel as though what Descript is offering is the future of editing, and I think in 10 years, most of the applications will be rising to that level, especially with the ability of AI to sort of analyze a clip and tell us what's in there. You know, I cut a conference a while ago, and it was robot thinking, because it was like, oh, somebody's talking, cut to that person. Right. You know, somebody's asking a question, cut to the wide shot. Like it was, you could almost put that into code and just be able to write something where you say, when this person answers, cut to their camera. When this person asks a question, cut to the wide shot. You know, I think that's not all editing, of course, because there's craft behind everything. But I think that there are certain jobs where it should be as robotic as that. And then the human comes in and makes creative decisions after that point.
Interesting.
So I am curious, Neil brought up this using the transcription service in Premiere Pro currently is allowing some of what you're using in Descript. How does it differ? How does Descript differ from Premiere Pro?
Descript is like, I mean, I'm not using their new version, which is Storyboard, which by their own marketing, they say is reinventing editing. I haven't tested that yet, but Descript is like editing a Word document, basically. So it will run AI on the entire file, all of the files, and tell you what the audio said. And you know, that transcription is probably 80-90% correct, depending on the quality of the audio and the voice of the person. But that's how I've been editing a lot of stuff lately, and I can then move that over to Premiere Pro for some fine cutting. I do still, cut entirely in Premiere Pro. I'm actually cutting a documentary right now that was recorded. The footage was recorded 20 years ago. The audio is really bad. And sometimes when I'm watching it and I need to just know where somebody's talking, I actually run the transcription across that just so I can get like little captions above the clip to sort of go, oh, this is a conversation. I need to slow this down and look at what these people are saying. But where there's no captions, I'm like, oh, this is just visuals. I'll just flit through this really quickly. Wow. So I am still using the transcription tool for that. And I'll use it for actual editing as well. But of course, the greatest advantage there is subtitles, and a lot of social media is sort of driven by subtitles now. So that's why you'll find a lot of videos now have subtitles on them in YouTube.
Right, and do you see, the art form or the craft changing even more drastically than it has since the advent of TikTok? Do you think anything faster is going to come about? YouTube has become too slow for the newer generation. They want 2 and 3 and 4 second videos. So yeah, it's almost a new art form. How do you cut and tell a story in 10 seconds?
It is. And I mean, who would have thought that we'd be in an age where the jump cut is like more common than a match cut?
Absolutely. It's
like insane. That's a standard part of the language now. So we're actually seeing the standard language of editing change as well. And there are some amazing YouTube videos out there that, I feel as though they're completely different worlds in a way. And I don't know where it's going. I don't know. I worry about the future of film because I feel like film is diminishing and the YouTube video is becoming a more common form. But the truth is that we'll always need to tell stories, and we'll always find a way to tell them. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, the influence that social media is having on film. I don't think it's going the other way as much. I don't think people are looking at Apocalypse Now and saying, what can this tell me about my social media video? I think it's more going the other way.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the biggest concern. I think the art, the actual art form behind filmmaking is kind of dissolving in a huge and in a very rapid way. Because if you've looked at the films that have been released for the last year, and you can name 10 that actually were worth their salt, it would be 9 out of 10. I would say 1 that stands out really.
Yeah.
So you look at the Marvel stuff, you look at the DC universe, and all of these guys, they're just pushing out. It's just CG kind of stuff. I mean, Marvel did a great job with Thanos' character. I think that was really something else, which was amazing. But there's really drivel that's coming out. I mean, Black Adam came out. I was dying to see it. It fell flat on its face for me, script-wise. The villain at the end, DC's goes into this whole kind of zombie look and all sorts of weird. They just don't know how to create a proper villain. So, the really beautiful films that used to pop, Shawshank Redemption, just as a weird, or The Green Mile, as an example. The cinematography was spot on. Not to say that Christopher Nolan's Batman was bad looking. It was greatly. It was shot brilliantly. You look at other things like Interstellar, fantastic. But those sorts of films are now beginning to not appear as frequently as before, and that's a real worry, because those were learning films you could learn from, and it would spark your imagination, even if you had a little camera in your hand, because you'd look for those sorts of angles in your garden or in your home or in your lounge, for that matter. But today it's kind of a more tricky. I call it for me it's the camera tricky generation. That's what I call them, where they flip cameras, they throw cameras, they chuck them in odd angles, and it's this swish cut, and It's just really, the pace has become insanely fast. And
Yeah,
what that
yet the
means
films
for
have
the
gotten
future,
longer.
they have. And what that means for the future film, I'm not sure. Everyone's expecting James Cameron's Avatar 2 to be awesome. And, I think you've seen trailer 1, 2, and 3. It's much of a muchness when it comes to what it was like for the first one. The first one was
Mm.
quite groundbreaking, and I don't think
Hmm.
it's going to make much of a dent compared to what Titanic had done.
Mm.
Titanic was a totally different sort of film. So my question to you, as somebody that teaches it, and I teach it as well, is how, what do they want to learn at this point in time? Is it on the editing side? Do you concentrate more on how to tell a story, the narrative, or is it more on the technicalities behind it, or is it how do I create a quick social media, or do you kind of, is it kind of all encompassing where you teach all of this?
Right.
Yeah,
What are you finding? There's the more, yeah, what's the demand out there?
it's yeah. Well, the demand is social media. That's what the demand is. People want to know how to make their own YouTube videos. In terms of the actual filmmaking side of it, I feel like there is a lack of it. What's the word? There's like a lack of attention given to the auteur in filmmaking anymore. Is that in my generation, you knew the names of all of the big directors who were pushing the form. And in the early days of the Marvel films, the superhero films, I feel like we still had that as well. It's that you knew
Yes.
Bryan Singer was the one who did X-Men, and Jon Favreau was the one who did Iron Man. I don't know who the directors are of these films anymore, except for maybe Sam Raimi. And I feel like there's a lack of attention to the auteur, the filmmaker as an auteur, because truthfully, a lot of these films are made before the director is even, brought onto the film. And that's a fact, that these special effects are done before the director is actually assigned to the film. And the director might not even see the special effects until the very end, when the person they decided to cast has had their face mapped onto the face of whoever was originally used in the special effects. So I feel like the attention has more gone to the studio and more gone to the producer,
Yes.
which I'm
Yes.
sure the
Okay.
studios are incredibly happy with. But we
Yeah.
don't have those creative forces that are pushing that. Now, historically, when film has just by trend started to become creatively bankrupt, I've found it's always been really good at self-correcting that. And you just got to look at the 70s for an indication of that. Is things collapsed by the end of the 60s, but then in the 70s we had these great filmmakers who came up and sort of stretched the form and turned it into something new and amazing. Now my concern is that social media is stealing away from that now. So in this abyss of creativity at the moment, who are going to be the auteurs who step up and say, no, we need to focus on this and make this great? Well, I'm worried that more attention is going towards making a 30-minute social media video about what you had for breakfast that day, rather than how to continue to tell great stories that are important,
Stories.
that everybody flocks to the cinema to see. I worry that we're losing that.
Yeah, I, I,
Oh,
I, I totally agree with it. Cinema is all but dead, I feel.
Well, we are
Um,
a couple of old curmudgeons as well. So
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
somebody 20, 30 years younger than us would have a more optimistic view. And
yeah.
hopefully, film schools are bringing up that next generation of Spielberg and Scorsese and people like that. I don't know who those people are right now, to be honest.
Well, film schools are still, funnily enough, they're still concentrating on the theory of form, the two-thirds rule that nobody ever gets to follow. They're talking about all the great filmmakers, the historians, and so on. But the new generation just bypass that entire syllabus or that entire chapter in the year, and they'll just write the exam just to get the marks. And in the back of their minds, they're probably thinking, "How am I going to shoot my next TikTok video?" So when I say cinema is dead, there's torrents are just killing cinema, right? So just everyone's downloading it. I mean, the moment it's out, it's down in 4K UHD, 10-bit HDR. So it's just there for you to watch at home. The true essence of cinema, going to it, people go to cinemas now, I think, more for just the audio experience. Like if you take Top Gun for Maverick as an example, or anything in IMAX, it's so they can't really recreate that at home. Some can, but not as as much as the IMAX experience. So it's becoming a novelty, whereas before it was something that was done for the pure pleasure of watching a film in its natural, well, as natural as could be, in the natural form. And now it's just again changing. So it would be nice to see what happens in the next probably 5 years. I would say it might be less. There might be another TikTok, something that might come up platform that's even quicker. That you might have 5-second videos, and it's a true art form to tell a story in 5 seconds. I must say.
Absolutely.
So it's
I would.
very interesting.
I think the diversity of content is a great thing, and we're finding that films don't have to be 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours. That you can tell a story in 5 seconds, and I think it's great that we're exploring that. But I do feel as though that anything really worthwhile to say is a slow, thoughtful process. It's not something that you should be doing quickly. It's not something that you should be doing that week. It's something that should take you years to do. And when I'm exposing my son to my son's 5, I'm exposing him to films and to social media as well. And I always want to make sure that he's having a good amount of content that somebody has sat down and thought about and actually gone through a process with, because I think that even if it's a film that I might not necessarily like, it's something that somebody has put a lot of time into, and that will always resonate more with you than something that somebody has just gone, I need to put some content out this week, quick, let's put the camera on and we'll film me reacting to something.
Do you feel that CG, right, and the advancements in visual effects has brought about kind of the demise of true, storytelling?
I don't think CG as a concept has. I think that the way that the industry treats CG is that CG is seen as something that should be done very fast, and that, we are hiring CG artists as though they're flies who can just drop and we can replace them with another fly. CG should be a thoughtful part of the process, and you should be stepping back and thinking, what do we want to do here, rather than what is the quickest way of doing this. There was a time when I felt like CG had so much potential for what it could bring to cinema, but I think because it is a digital form, and it's something that can be done and redone again very quickly, or at least theoretically really quickly, that it has just become something that is just rushed out. And that's why everything looks the same, because when you have to make a quick decision, you would rather fall back on something that works, rather than taking the time to explore what's something different. And that's why I'm not a big fan of Marvel films. They just don't speak to me at all. But probably like the Marvel stuff that has resonated with me the most has been something like Guardians of the Galaxy, especially the second one, because just visually it is just so unique and different. And somebody didn't go, let's just make it look like the last film that came out. They really pushed it to try and make it look like something very, very different. And when I saw Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 in the cinema, it was a feast to watch. I mean, I just loved it. I love being in that world, and I find that happens less and less now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I could see a future episode where we just get a bunch of people on talking about their favorite films and why they're their favorite films. The best story. What's the best story of all time? What's the best cinematography? I think we've got a potential. We'll have to see what that ends up being.
Absolutely.
But I think it's time to wrap things up. And really, people should check out your YouTube channel if they want to learn Premiere Pro, how to do cool things in Premiere Pro.
Premiere Pro, I mean, like I said, I do have a more technical side to my brain, and Premiere Pro is, I feel as though YouTube Premiere Pro videos are mostly sort of beginner level sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there was a bit of a gap in the market for like, well, what if you know Premiere Pro, but you want to know how to do something better or different? So all of my videos are sort of targeted at what I would call intermediate users who are looking to do something better or different. And that's been a really good thing. I also have a course on LinkedIn Learning about Adobe Audition. So if you wanted to learn all of Adobe Audition all the way through, I have a 6-hour course up there on which is the essential training for Adobe Audition. And I should also mention, since he's a fan of the show, I co-wrote the 2nd edition of the Cool Stuff in Premiere Pro with Yala Leopold as well.
Oh, awesome.
Yay.
So my final question would be could you just name your top 3 films?
Oh, well, I've already said my top 1 a lot of times, and that's Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now is one of the most amazing bits of art put on screen I've ever seen. It's a difficult one to recommend to everybody, but 7, I think, is some of the most amazing storytelling I've ever seen on film. And then a third one, it would probably be, I would probably say Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien, the first one. I just think is amazing as well. How to do a science fiction film as a haunted house film.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Now I want to go home and watch movies. That is great. Okay. Thank you so much. Really, we're going to have you back when
Absolutely.
Neil can be on in person because
I want to interview Neil about everything he does on the Adobe Forum. I think he's an amazing presence there, and I would just like to ask him questions about what he does and his process.
I think that's a really good idea. I think we set that up where Neil is the guest.
Yeah, totally. There you go. There you go. That's next week's show, maybe.
Paul, it's been a pleasure. I'm gonna have a look at your channel, definitely, without a doubt.
Oh, thanks so much, Mo.
Yeah, absolutely. Been a pleasure. Fantastic.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, guys. Ciao.